A USGS geologist warned the Bureau in 1972 the Teton Dam would fail by piping, and 3 years later it did exactly that. The geologist was David Schleicher, and his memo named the exact failure mechanism that was coming. He wrote that the heavily fissured rhyolite under the dam would let water carve a tunnel right through the loess core. His draft included a sardonic recommendation nobody would have missed. Set up motion picture cameras downstream of the dam, he suggested, to document the flood that was on its way. His own supervisors at the USGS spent 6 months watering the memo down before passing it along. The version that reached the Bureau in July of 1973 left out the camera quip and left out the urgency. The Bureau filed the softened memo and kept building. On Saturday, June 5, 1976, the Teton Dam collapsed exactly the way Schleicher had predicted. 11 people died, and around 25,000 were left without a home. Roughly 16,000 head of livestock drowned in their pens that morning. Property damage came in between $400 million and $2 billion 1976 dollars. The dam stood 305 feet tall and stretched 3,100 feet across the crest. Behind it sat a reservoir holding 288,000 acre-feet of water near full pool. That's a small city flooded 8 stories deep. The federal independent panel that investigated the failure published its report 6 months later, and the verdict was brutal. They named the mechanism as internal erosion through the foundation rock and the loess core. They identified the design choice that doomed the dam, and they cleared the on-site construction crew completely. The failure was baked in at the drawing board 4 years before the first shovel hit the ground. Here's the geology no engineer should have ignored. The dam sat in Teton Canyon on rhyolitic ash flow tuff. That kind of rock cools from molten state into vertical columns and fractures top to bottom as it forms. Some of those fissures at the Teton site were 6 feet apart with openings wide enough to fit your hand into. To anyone who reads volcanic geology, that bedrock wasn't a foundation, it was a sieve. The Bureau's plan was to seal the fissures with grout, a cement slurry pumped under pressure into the rock until it solidified. That worked for the top layer, the so-called grout cap. Below the grout cap, deep in the canyon, hundreds of joints stayed open the whole way down to the riverbed. Water under reservoir pressure had a clean path through every one of them. For the dam itself, the Bureau used wind-blown loess. Loess is a fine, dusty silt with almost no clay mixed into it. Dry loess holds its shape just fine when you squeeze a handful of it.
Wet loess has almost no cohesion at all because the grains have nothing binding them together. Run water through a handful for a few seconds and the silt washes away grain by grain. The channel you leave behind doesn't seal back up, it widens. That's the failure mode the engineers call internal erosion or piping. Water finds a path through the dam, picks up loess grains as it goes, and the channel grows in cross-section every second. More water flow strips more loess off the channel walls. A wider channel then carries even more water on the next pass. The rate of erosion accelerates with the size of the pipe, so the failure runs away faster the longer it runs. A second possibility the independent panel kept open was hydraulic fracturing of the core. Under enough reservoir pressure, wet loess can crack from the inside, opening seepage paths the way frost splits a sidewalk. Either way, you get the same self-feeding failure. A full reservoir squeezing wet loess against fissured rock canyon walls means a runaway pipe is on its way. The fix had been industry standard in earth-filled dam design for decades. Build a filter layer just downstream of the impervious core. The filter is coarse sand or gravel sized to let water through but trap any soil grains the seepage is carrying. It catches the silt that starts to move and stops the pipe before it can grow large. Arthur Casagrande, the Dean of American Geotechnical Engineering, had been preaching this approach for decades. He called it the principle of multiple lines of defense. The Teton design had no filter behind the core. The grout cap was the only line of defense between the reservoir and the loess core. The cap stopped at the top of the bedrock. Below it, the canyon was wide open all the way down to the riverbed. Here is what that meant on the morning of June 5th. The reservoir had been filling for 6 months and was approaching maximum pool. Around 7:30, crews on the dam spotted a leak in the right abutment, and the water was muddy. Clear seepage through bedrock is usually a safe sign. Brown water tells you the dam's core is washing out the backside and the runaway pipe is already running. Bob Robison was the Bureau's project construction engineer on site that morning. By 9, Robison had walked the seepage area, watched the flow get worse by the minute, and concluded the dam was going to fail. He had no formal authority to call an evacuation that morning. He called the sheriffs in Madison and Fremont counties anyway and told them to start moving people off the river.
Robison stayed on top as a sinkhole formed on the downstream slope. He was the last man off the dam before it gave way. At 11:55 in the morning, the Crest sagged into the reservoir and the breach tore open. Within hours, the entire 288,000 acre-feet of water poured down the Teton River Valley. Wilford and Sugar City were wiped off the riverbank entirely. About 2/3 of Rexburg was displaced from their homes. The flood wave reached Idaho Falls before the day was over. The reason the death toll was 11 and not thousands is that Robison made an evacuation call he wasn't authorized to make. Around 25,000 people were in the path of that water. Most of them got out of the way alive. A Bureau engineer in a hard hat had picked up a phone 2 hours before he had any official reason to do so. The independent panel was led by Wallace Chadwick. It also included Arthur Casagrande, Ralph Peck, and Bolton Seed, 4 of the most respected geotechnical engineers alive at the time. Their report pinned the failure on the single design choice that doomed the dam. The Bureau had treated the grout cap as the only barrier against internal erosion, with no filter behind the loess core. Casagrande's own verdict was published in the engineering literature a year later. He wrote that sealing the core foundation contact and providing adequate filter and drainage are essential elements of all earth dams. In other words, this didn't have to happen. The fix existed, was widely known, and was left out of the design at Teton. Congress passed the Reclamation Safety of Dams Act in 1978. Every existing Bureau dam in the country had to be inspected and, where the design was suspect, retrofitted before it kept operating. The Bureau abandoned the proposal to rebuild the Teton Dam on the same site. The year prior to Teton's collapse, the Banqiao Dam in China killed at least 26,000 people in a single night. Teton is famous not because the death toll was high, but because the breach was filmed live in daylight by camera crews. The footage of the Crest sagging into the water was on the evening news the same night. Engineering catastrophes had been recorded before that morning. Teton was the first one America watched in color. A geologist warning the Bureau about Teton sounds like a one-off. Soviet engineers had 3 years of warnings about the AZ5 button and still pressed it. That video's right here on Sketchy Science.